Gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming on this cold, rainy day. I'm Nina Stritzler-Levine, director of the Bard Graduate Center Gallery and co-curator of our current exhibition, Artek and the Altos, Creating a Modern World. I am honored to be introducing this afternoon's event, Esa-Pekka Salonen and Justin Davidson in conversation. Now, our program did not provide a specific title for this afternoon's conversation, although it is noted that it's focusing on how Esa-Pekka Salonen's Finnish roots have informed his career as a composer and a conductor. Certainly, this is one line of connectivity to our exhibition. Artek, at its founding in 1935, was a Finnish company, and it had four co-founders, Niels Gustav Hall, philosopher, art historian, art critic, Myra Gulliksen, born Ahlstrom, philanthropist, patron of the arts, and the two key players in our project, the architects Alvar Aalto and Aino Marcio Aalto, were all Finnish. The lines of connectivity between our exhibition and this afternoon's program might also be further clarified in another way that I'm eager for you to consider this afternoon, and that I'd like to explain as a proposed title for this afternoon's event. That is the essence of music. Because what we have here is the coming together of two essences of everyday life: music and architecture, which we have in our exhibition. And I want to be clear that I don't want to repeat a connection that is already well known and associated with Esa-Pekka Salonen. We know he has participated in other conversations about the connection between architecture and music. I'm referring, of course, to the great works of architecture where he has performed, or his well-known friendship with Frank Gehry. No, my proposed title, The Essence of Music, is related to the ontological meaning of essence. Being. This is what I'd like you to think about today, music as being. And I came to this thought after reading a fascinating article by Christoph Cox, a professor of philosophy at Hampshire College, called Nietzsche, Dionysus and the Ontology of Music, in which he argued that through Nietzsche, who made the famous statement, "Without music, life would be an error," one comes to understand that, and now I quote Cox, music is the guide to ontology, to world interpretation, and to the way the world is. This is fantastic. It is an ontological echo that provides us with an aural, A-U-R-A-L, representation of the very nature of things, unquote. Well, such a statement has a resonance for the Bard Graduate Center's mission, but it also brings me back to Finnishness, because indeed Finland, this small remote country, although part of the European Union, nonetheless remote, is a place where music and architecture are recognized as great essences of everyday life. This is extremely important, as part of a culture in ways that I fundamentally believe in the United States we might consider as a model. Finland privileges music at the most basic societal level. From a young age, children learn about it, listen to it, engage with it. Music is instilled in their hearts, their minds, and their beings, children. The prevailing concerns in American contemporary culture that somehow classical music is too difficult to grasp, out of touch, we hear this all the time, sharply contrasts with these Finnish values. Now, certainly, no two people better understand Nietzsche's comment, "Without music, life would be an error," than our two interlocutors. So let me specifically turn to them. A graduate of Harvard University in Columbia, where he earned a PhD in music composition, Justin Davidson spent 12 years as a journalist with Newsday, the newspaper of Long Island, where he was employed when he won a Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2002. My proposed title for this discussion, The Essence of Music, seemed even more appropriate when, I have to admit, surfing Justin Davidson, as we do on the internet, I discovered the jury's citation for his Pulitzer Prize. Now I quote that jury. Given the Pulitzer Prize for his crisp coverage of classical music that captures its essence, unquote. In a 2012 interview with the blog Newspaper Alum, he credited Newsday for allowing him to diversify his activities as a journalist, or as he explained, quote, do a wide range of things that were not on his beat, unquote. I like that so much. And where he witnessed up front the realities of the newspaper business, sadly today, downsizing staff, closing departments, and eliminating content. But Davidson has remained ahead of the curve. In 2007, he landed a job at New York Magazine, where he has capitalized on both areas of his beat at Newsday, working as the magazine's architecture and music critic. Now, providing an introductory summary of Esa-Pekka Salonen's achievements and professional activities is a complicated task. They are innumerable and multifaceted, and I have to say, thinking of how he crisscrosses the world as conductor and composer reminds me of, yes, Alvar Aalto, who made 10 trips to the United States between 1939 and 1948, at a moment, think about it, on ocean liners or on, yes, airplanes, jetliners as they were called, and traveling when, doing so was much more complicated than today. But, if I may say, Maestro Salonen, born in Helsinki, he trained at the Sibelius Academy, where composing, not conducting, was his primary area of study, and a practice that he continues in tandem with conducting today. His pieces for symphony orchestra include LA Variations 1996, Foreign Bodies 2001, Insomnia 2002, Wing on Wing 2004, Nix 2011, as well as 2 concertos. He made his debut in the United States in 1984 with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and of course many of you know that he became its 10th musical director in 1992, a position he held for the next 17 years, as the LA Philharmonic became one of the world's preeminent orchestras. He worked closely with the board to realize the Walt Disney Concert Hall, designed by Frank Gehry, that opened in 2003. Salonen retains close ties to LA in ways that reflect his commitment to composing and to the role of classical music in contemporary life. His legacy in LA is perhaps, I feel, most fully expressed in the Esa-Pekka Salonen Commissions Fund that supports contemporary classical music. That fund had an initial endowment of $1.5 million. He will take the Philharmonia Orchestra to the Edinburgh International Festival, the BBC Proms on tour in Switzerland. I'm going fast to make the point. And France will lead the Myths and Rituals Festival. He will make guest appearances with orchestras all around the world. In addition, he is a man driven by a deep social consciousness, as seen in one of his most important initiatives, the Baltic Sea Festival. He dedicated to raising awareness of environmental and political issues in that region. To come to the many engagements he has in New York, through spring 2019, he holds the position of Marie-Josée Kravis Composer-in-Residence at the New York Philharmonic. In the fall, he will conduct a concert with the New York Philharmonic at the Park Avenue Armory of works by his longtime Finnish friend, Kaija Saariaho, and he will be replacing James Levine, conducting all of the Met Orchestra's concerts at Carnegie Hall in spring 2017. Just a few days ago, Michael Cooper wrote about him in the New York Times as the man who brings cool to the New York music scene, a quality that I guess must be added to his remarkable resume. Today, for an hour or so, in this intimate setting, it feels kind of Finnish to me, we have his undivided attention. Please join me in welcoming to the Bard Graduate Center 2 acclaimed contributors to the essence of music, Justin Davidson and Esa-Pekka Salonen.
Thank you everybody for being here. It strikes me that the word that best describes Esa-Pekka Salonen is musician. And it's a wonderful word because it encompasses so many different things, and you heard some of them in Nina's introduction. He's a composer, a conductor, trained as a performer, a French horn player, an impresario, starting a festival, a teacher. These are all activities that in our fragmented cultural life have become separated, and people tend to focus on one or the other. And Esa-Pekka unites these things again in a way that was common, say, in the 19th century, but became increasingly uncommon in the 20th. And just to reiterate the intensity of his engagement with music and also with New York in the last couple of months as composer-in-residence with the New York Philharmonic. He led a chamber concert of new works at National Sawdust in Williamsburg, part of the New York Philharmonic's Contact series. Alan Gilbert conducted his new work Caravana, which we will talk about a little bit later. He then returned a week later or so to conduct Messiaen's immense and colorful Turangalila Symphony. He is in the course of conducting a run of a new production of Strauss's Elektra at the Metropolitan Opera, and I'm quite sure that this morning what he was doing and what he will be doing as soon as we let him go is go back and keep working on his cello concerto that he's writing for Yo-Yo Ma. This is a very rich life in music. It's a very rich life as a musician, and we're fortunate that so much of it is spent here in New York. So much so that we keep wanting him to spend more time in New York. So, when there was an opening at the New York Philharmonic for the next music director, I and some other critics were really hoping that he would step up to the plate. He said no, and I was still hoping that no in Finnish means maybe. Then, just as we were getting used to the idea that that wasn't going to happen, James Levine stepped down from the Metropolitan Opera. I believe he said maybe in Finnish again. But we're fortunate that even without a kind of official home here in New York, he's here a lot. So his roots and the roots of this conversation are in Finland, a population of 5 million, roughly the population of Minnesota. And I'm just going to read off some of the names of Esa-Pekka's colleagues, conductors on the international circuit, who are also from Finland. Susanna Melki, Joran Panola has now died, Sakari Oramo, Osmo Venska, Jukka-Pekka Saraste, Mikko Frank, and then the composers Kaija Sarjaho and Magnus Lindberg, and many more. What was in the water?
You're not the first one who is asking that question, and I don't have an answer. At least I don't have a comprehensive answer that would kind of put a stop to that particular discourse. Because a musical career is always a combination of lots of elements, obviously talent, training, opportunity, an environment that supports and nurtures young, talented people, and luck. And sometimes things happen when there's a critical mass. Enough people who think alike, who have enough talent and dedication and so on. And in terms of the explosion of Finnish young composers in the late 70s and early 80s had to do with the fact that there was a group of people happened to be studying at the same time, and everybody happened to feel that Finland, because of its cultural and geographical position and history, had kind of isolated itself from the European intellectual trends and so on. So we decided to open doors and windows to Europe. And of course we were driven by some kind of pseudo-sociological motivation, such as listening to serial music makes you a better person. I have revised my opinion on that point later in life, but when I was in my late teens, it seemed to be like a very good motto. And I must say that, apart from the sort of obvious things about Finland, i.e. It's a well-run society with a lot of emphasis on education, the arts. It's a deeply democratic Nordic country with a deep democratic tradition. The income differences between various citizens, while bigger now than they used to be in the 70s and 80s, are relatively small, unlike, say, here or in or Russia or other places like that. So all this somehow makes it easier to get into the arts and to have a career. Because, for instance, for a young conductor, it's a vicious circle. Because in order to develop as a conductor, you have to conduct, but you can't practice at home. So somebody has to give you an opportunity to conduct, knowing that you might not deliver 100% yet. So there has to be an understanding of making an investment and tolerating the consequences and so on. And in the Finnish culture, this was understood. So me and my friends and my colleagues, whose names Justin listed, we're all given these opportunities. And our older colleagues were extremely supportive. There was an understanding of continuity. There was an understanding that if you have been helped once upon a time, you have to put back something to the system when it's your turn. So the generation before mine was extremely supportive of our work. And this, I guess, can more easily happen in a small country where practically everybody knows each other. I mean, this is shocking. Every time I go back to Helsinki, it really feels like a family. Dysfunctional and suffocating and deeply annoying, like families are, but family nevertheless. So it's a combination of lots of things.
Has that continued? Was that a generational thing, or is that an ongoing aspect of Finnish culture?
Things are still pretty good. Now, if you look at the history of the Nordic countries, this sort of education-focused, equality-focused, in talent investing kind of society was built by the Social Democrats. The Social Democratic parties used to be the dominant parties in all Scandinavian countries since the war. In Sweden, they ruled for 50 years without an interruption. And I must say, and I'm not making a political statement here, that it was the social democratic parties that created Scandinavia and the welfare state and well-functioning societies. Obviously, every country has problems and so on. And now, of course, with the refugee crisis in Europe, things have become tougher. But I would still say that the foundation laid by the Social Democrats is still there. It's quite firm. Despite the efforts of the right-wing governments trying to dismantle everything that was built. Finland has a right-wing government at the moment, and they have done their best to weaken the position of Finnish higher education. The Helsinki University, for instance, a couple of days ago sacked all its music teachers and so on, which is unheard of. I mean, they have had music teachers on staff for 400 years. So through 5, 6 wars, plague, famine, this and that. And now there's a slight sort of dip in the stock market. So now they're sacking people, which is incredibly stupid because, of course, a small country especially, its only hope is highly, highly educated population. Especially in a global situation where manufacturing goes to where it's cheapest and so on, and the middle class is suffering, and people have the need to retrain themselves, but there's nowhere to go really, and this kind of hopelessness that then turns many middle class members to Trump supporters, whatever horrors there are. And I'm sad to say that Finland has its traps as well, and they have been voted in the parliament and so on. But I'm hoping that this is just like a temporary insanity phase in the history of Scandinavia.
Well, I'm glad to hear you make an economic argument, not just for higher education, but specifically for conductor training. It seems like that's, along with burning care and good design, one of the other things that we can envy the Nordic countries is this high level of investment in the arts specifically.
I think there's an absolutely direct correlation between economy and education in this way that if you think about the demographics of symphony orchestras in this country, for instance, they do not reflect the demographics of the society by any means. They look very different from what you see out on the streets. And the reason for that is that to get good enough musical education is expensive. And if the middle class that used to value education above anything else is being decimated or is in trouble and so on, then we see the disappearance of minorities, ethnic minorities first, and then we will also, if the trend continues, then we will also be seeing the disappearance of whatever is called the majority, and then because it's global business, quite soon we will have a new sort of homogeneity in symphony orchestras, but they will not look like the societies where we live. So I think many of these things come back to a very simple equation about income and distribution of income within a society. It's sad, but that's how it is.
So at that time, you were deeply rooted in Finland, in the Finnish education system. Every Finnish composer, conductor, musician was reared on Sibelius and Finnish nationalist music. But yours is a generation that also, as you said, opened up to Europe. And specifically, you were looking at Germany, France, Pierre Boulez, and a kind of European internationalist, modernist culture. And I've heard you say on other occasions, as you mentioned before, you've sort of moved away from this idea of serialism being good for you. But tell us a little bit about what it was like what was your musical culture at that time, and how your sense of that has changed.
I used to say that mine was the first generation that didn't grow up in the shadow of Sibelius. And now when I think about it, it's only partly true. But at least we didn't feel like we were crushed by this massive thing. And if you talk to composers now in their 80s, such as Aulis Sallinen, for instance, he would tell a very different sort of story. So I thought I was kind of free of the Sibelius thing, and I found his music deeply annoying, and I really hated it quite actively, as young people quite often do. And one of the reasons why I decided to go to study composition in Milan, Italy, was that I wanted to find a Sibelius-free zone with good coffee. Coffee was really bad in Finland those days. And of course what happened was that there was an antiquariat very close to La Scala, and I used to browse there quite often after my composition lessons. And one day, in one corner I found a pile of pocket scores, and there was the 7th Symphony of Sibelius for 500 liras, which was about the price of an espresso. So I bought it. It was almost like buying a porn magazine or something. It was so against my statements I had made back home. And I took the bus back to my digs in Magenta. I was staying in a sort of industrial part of suburb of Milan, and started reading the score. And I got terribly moved. And I thought, okay, this music, even on page, looks so different from all other music on the planet. And I got back to my house, and I started playing it on the piano, and I was very, very moved. Because it somehow, not only did I then realize that this music is unlike any other music and it's very, very unique, but also it was like my country, my nature, my birds, my God knows what. And I thought, okay, I'm not that free of Sibelius after all. What happened, of course, you know, young people have the need to know what is right and what is wrong. And because when we're young, we tend to look at the world in a very sort of black and white way. And Boulez gave you the answers. He said, that's wrong. Out. That's okay. In. And as a young person, I found this really attractive. Because, you know, if I did what Boulez told me to do, I was fine. I was like one of the good guys, not one of the bad guys like Shostakovich and those insignificant people. And so we kind of followed the gurus.
Can we take a moment to turn off our phones?
Can everybody please check their phones, turn them off? Somebody power down, everybody power down their phones because we're hearing it constantly.
Somebody's cell phone keeps beeping.
Yeah.
Might have been mine. My mom usually calls me this.
Okay, please turn the power off.
Yeah. So we're talking about Bullet.
He has to deal with this all the time. He's on the podium making music.
Yeah. Anyway, so.
So you came to see things less and.
Yeah. Well, you know, when I got older, I realized that actually I can't see art as a moral judgment, i.e. what is right and what is wrong. That's not the business we're in. And I started to understand that it's not seeking the truth. And even dealing with something that is called the truth with a capital T, I thought I'd leave that bit to politicians because they're very good at that. And there's something else which cannot be quantified and cannot be put under these simple categories. And also lots of things that I felt as a young radical seemed, when I was the young radical person, I hated lots of things that actually started to feel more and more essential to me. Um, and also the fact that I was conducting, and the things I loved deeply were things that I was not allowed to do, as per Mr. Pulitze's book of rules. And don't get me wrong, I admire Boulez more than almost anybody, and he was incredibly helpful and supportive to me when I was starting out, and he's one of the greatest things ever happened to this planet. But I disagree with him.
And a lot of people who made that journey, who started out deeply enmeshed in mid-century modernism, or as it evolved in the 60s and 70s and continued sort of that austere path, their rejection of it, or rather their evolution from this black and white of right and wrong, evolved into, well, okay, that was all wrong, and that was a different kind of evolution. But I get the feeling that for you, that tradition you were raised in is still a deeply important part of your formation and your musical sensibility.
I think it's a highly typical path of almost any person, that you want to have these absolutes when you grow up, because the world is too bewildering and too complex, and if every option is open to you, then you just panic, because that much choice is painful. So you stick to these like totems of culture, and then as you get older you realize that there's a whole lot of stuff between black and white, and between those totems, and that maybe the most important and interesting stuff is material that cannot be adequately put into any kind of box, and that art is something that is always in movement. Things keep changing, and that we also have to accept that we are not immune to fashion, to fads, dernier cri kind of thing. We are not immune to that. We would like to be, and we look at pop and rock music as, you know, these kind of helpless systems being ruled by child emperors of unlimited powers, i.e. this autumn's sounds, and you know, this synth sound is so 2040. It's like you can't use it. But we are not immune. There's this very weird mechanism that makes some things go out and some things are in, and you know, when I was growing up, the one piece that was played every week practically and automatically provided full houses and so on was the Franck Symphony D minor. When did you hear it last in a concert? I mean, I haven't heard it in...
It's been a long time.
Yeah, I mean, 20 years or something like that, and in my case, and so on, and also in contemporary classical music, there is this kind of very interesting thing, that something seems all of a sudden very old-fashioned, like retro, and something seems to be fresh and acute and so on. And I would be really interested in finding out more about the mechanism, what it is. It's like language, in a way, that there's an expression that somebody coins somewhere, and then next week everybody's using that expression. Or food, burrata, right? I mean, 5 years ago nobody had ever heard of burrata, and now it's, you can't buy an ice cream without somebody putting burrata on top of it. And kale, okay? Isn't that disgusting? But every goddamn restaurant, kale. But where did that come from? beet salad, okay? And when I was studying in Milan, the balsamico di Modena was something that was used in desserts. A drop of that added the sort of little acidity and sweetness to desserts. That was the family I stayed with. The grandmother only used aceto in desserts, and now of course, you know, the millions and millions and millions of gallons of this thing is being produced, not in Modena, most likely, you know, Shanghai or something like that. But it's everywhere. So please, can somebody explain to me how this works? Because these are not random things, right? I mean, there must be some kind of mechanism.
There's an algorithm.
Yeah. So can you just write that down for me?
So I want us to listen to a minute or so of a piece you wrote in the days we're talking about. I think this is 1982. This piece is it's called Floof, Songs of a Homeostatic Homer. And let's just listen to a little bit of it, then I'll ask you what was on your mind when you wrote it.
You can't put it louder?
So where were you at this point when you were writing this in your evolution through Boulesianism?
Still under the influence, as it were.
Of Boulez.
Yeah, but trying to find my way out of it. Through parody, irony, humor. I mean, this piece was based on a short story by Stanisław Lem, the great Polish science fiction writer, and it was about the sort of post-human era, where everybody is a cybernetic system, and there were two cybernetic inventors, Trurl and Clapausius, and they were competing with each other. And Trurl had made a poet, cybernetic poet, digital poet, that would become so productive and so skilled that it would then replace every other poet. Which would be like economically sensible and, you know, to focus production of poetry into like one computer and so on. And the piece then describes the development of this algorithm poet, because like every Windows user knows that things usually don't work. So the first attempt of the poet was what you just heard, the sort of grunts and burps and farts, and because the algorithm is not fine-tuned yet, and then in the course of this 12-minute piece, the machine finds its poetic legs and starts writing very complex poems based on tensor algebra, and the very last part of that piece is a rap 12-tone rap, a love song using the terminology of tensor algebra. So it's a basically optimistic little story.
Let's stick with your composing activities for a little bit. And while we're doing this, I hope you either have or have been given some cards on which to write down some questions, and I invite you, if you have them, to pass them to somebody who will pick them up and pass them up to me, and we'll go through them. But in the meantime, you have always wanted to maintain this core of your life as a composer, always going back to it. And we'll talk about conducting in a little bit, but I wanted to ask you as a composer, how you make room in your brain, in your life, in your musical sensibility with all of the stuff that goes on. How do you clear this space for composing? You've written a lot of pieces which have this kind of very high energy, intense, kinetic quality in a lot of passages. And I always feel like, maybe they're a reflection of what it feels like in your life to be constantly moving around the world. But I also know that in order to write those things, you have to be alone in a room someplace for long periods of time, doing virtually nothing in order to finally get that on paper. So especially with all of the music that you have going through your life all the time, all the music that you're conducting, that you're studying, that you're preparing for, how do you clear that space for the music that comes from you?
That's the biggest struggle in my life, of course. Doing virtually nothing. It's true because composing, of course, is highly eternal. To such a degree that one day my son was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and he was lying in the sofa like this. And I said, "Oliver, what are you doing?" "I'm composing." I think the biggest challenge for me is the very, very different metabolics between performing as a conductor and composing. Because conducting, of course, is highly intense. It's very, very social. You're dealing with 100 people, which can be interesting. And you're kind of feeding off their energy, and you're trying to focus them, and ideally in such a way that they don't realize that somebody's manipulating them. But in the best case scenario, you create an illusion that they're doing what they want to do, and somebody's just kind of enabling it. Enabler has become a bad word lately. Somebody explain that to me. Anyway.
It depends what you're enabling.
I guess, yeah. And it's also highly public. You come in, and it's a nice profession because people clap. You come in. I mean, where else does it happen? And then, in best case scenario, they even clap afterwards.
And ask you to do it again.
Yeah, but of course, for instance, with Electra, it's very, very intense, and I'm completely shaken after the show, and then I can't sleep until, 4 a.m., something like that, because I'm just wound up and the score plays in my head, and so whereas, of course, composing is the total opposite. A 15-minute piece might take a year to write, and there are days when absolutely nothing happens. That was me now. Sorry. Absolutely nothing happens, and it's like running a marathon as opposed to 100 meters. And it's very lonely also. And to balance between those two states of mind and body is very hard. So I need a transition time between activities. I need like a week or 10 days to calm down from conducting so that I can actually hear my own voice, my own thoughts, rather than Richard Strauss's or somebody else's.
So you can't compose in the morning, go to rehearsal in the afternoon?
Well, it depends on the stage of composition, because if I'm writing out the score, something that has been invented already, but I'm just like
Transcribing.
fleshing it out, like writing the last round of orchestration and so on. That I can do, because you're no longer at the sort of very vulnerable stage of trying to create something from nothing, which essentially is composing. I quite often like to compare composing with churning butter. You all do that, of course. But what happens is that when you pour the, whatever it is, cream and salt in the churn, and you start churning, for a very long time nothing happens. And you feel like you are a total idiot doing this, because nothing is going to happen. It's like you just do this and butter comes from the shop, and not from the churn. Then, after this very long time, frustrating time, little grains start to appear. And from that to butter, it takes a very short time. So the curve is like nothing, 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 and then butter. And composing, at least in my case, is a bit like that. Actually, a lot like that. So I'm playing with material, I'm writing things down, throwing them away, and, nothing. It's just like this liquid thing. And then there's a moment when little islands start to appear. So that, has an identity, that has an identity, that. And then they find a way to stick together, and that becomes butter. But when I'm in the churning part, I feel very vulnerable, because it would be so very tempting to go to Stravinsky or Ravel or Mussorgsky and just borrow a bit. I take that bit. I don't think anybody will notice, or something like that. And I get nightmares about this. I had this moment 2 months ago, roughly. In my dream, I heard the beginning of my cello concerto. It was wonderful. I was very, very happy. Beautiful and original and haunting. And I woke up and I was ecstatic, and I said to my wife, okay, I got it. I know how it starts. And then I went to my studio and started playing what I had heard in my dream on the piano. And it was a slow section from Mussorgsky's Third Symphony, note by note. So, yeah, I think you just have to suffer. Like Sibelius used to say, you have to suffer the attributes of pain to purify yourself. How about that as a motto?
You also have to listen differently, right? I mean, composers tend to listen and immerse themselves in music selfishly for what they can borrow and absorb, and exclude a lot of things that they're not that interested. But as a conductor, you're dealing with such a broad range, and you have to do the opposite, which is be vigilant not to let Lutoslawski's Third Symphony seep so far into your subconscious that you're writing that out. I was actually thinking of the challenge of that watching Mozart in the Jungle, where the conductor, who's been working on a symphony for decades, finally produces it, and it's an amalgam of everything he's ever conducted in his entire career. Let's listen to a little bit of Caravana, which is your most recent piece.
Most recent big piece, yeah.
Most recent big performed piece.
Yeah.
This is the New York Philharmonic playing a few weeks ago. When you hear this in juxtaposition with the piece that you wrote some 30 years ago, do they feel like they belong to different universes? Do you sense a continuity between them? Have you come back around to some of what you were dealing with in Floof?
Well, they certainly sound very different. But 30 years is a long time. And I think I would be deeply alarmed if my recent piece would sound the same my 30-year-old piece sounded. So that would be kind of scary. And in fact, what happened, I went to LA for a couple of days between shows here, and on the way back, there was on the entertainment system of the airplane, there was a remix of Michael Jackson's Bad from 1988, which was produced by Quincy Jones, and one of the greatest pop records ever. And I started listening to it, and I was taken right back to Floof, the time, and I somehow had this very strange feeling of becoming that young man for a minute or so. So it was like music has this power actually, that it peels off the how do you call the rings of the tree trunk, every year there's a new ring. So it peels them off and you find sort of original material, whatever it was. And sometimes we all know that a piece of music or a moment in some musical composition takes us back to a very specific moment in our lives. And this did that. And I don't feel that different actually. That's the strange thing. It's like expression changes and the tools we have in our toolbox change, and the statements we want to make are different, and of course, as you said, that a moment ago, that you sometimes think that my busy pieces are about what it is to be me in this crazy world and so on. But I think anybody who does anything creative or anything at all, baking a cake or whatever, it has to do with how it feels to be me to some degree. And of course, one of the things that makes us what we are is the fact that we can bend the thumb over the palm like this. We are the only species that can do this. So this has allowed us to build tools and build Alvar Aalto chairs in this room and what we call culture. And this has allowed us to destroy our environment to such a degree that very soon we have these algorithm poets writing poetry to other robots, if this carrying on continues. But I think this also has allowed us to express ourselves in a way we couldn't otherwise, i.e. we can paint paintings, we can make sculpture, we can write music, we can play music, we can create an infrastructure that allows a cultural expression. And therefore, almost anything we do, or everything we do, is some form of self-expression, definitely. It's the medium that varies and the degree of sophistication and so on, but the thing itself doesn't.
So we have various questions from the audience about conducting, and I'd like to frame it in the same way about how your conducting has evolved over time. So famously in 1983, you were a very young musician. Nobody had outside of Finland had really ever heard of you. You were summoned to the Philharmonia Orchestra when Michael Tilson Thomas backs out of a concert, he was ill or something, and conduct Mahler's Third on very little notice, and makes this huge splash. A year later, he's making his debut with the Los Angeles Philharmonic and establishing the basis of a relationship that, of course, lasted for a long time. So you've conducted Mahler's Third since then, I assume many times. Does your relationship, or the way you interpret that piece, well, what is the relationship between the way you're doing it now and the way you did it in 1983? And is that something internal to you, or do you think there's a kind of Esa-Pekka Salonen vintage, like, you know, somebody outside is listening, oh yes, that's 1983 Mahler 3.
Well, I think that my relationship with many of these masterpieces has changed radically. It's more like when I was younger, they were my enemies, so I had to beat them up. Like it was like wrestling. So with Mahler 3, I felt that I had like a half Nelson on Mahler 3, so I could sort of wrestle it to the ground. It was kind of shaking a bit still, but I managed to kind of keep it done. Now, it's more like meeting an old friend, somebody you know very well, and you don't have to prove yourself. You know, and a lot of stuff can be left unsaid because each other understand each other quite well. So I today feel much less like forcing the music into some kind of a concept. So I'm more interested in, you know, it's more like a car mechanic decides to become a gardener after like decades of fixing cars, and you know, like screwing and, you know, dealing with nuts and bolts and so on. And then you realize that actually garden is profoundly different because they grow anyway. So they grow because they have their DNA and they there's the photosynthesis and what have you. And gardener is somebody who kind of just makes sure that the right plants grow, and you prune a little bit here and there, and it's deeply satisfying to see this kind of process in front of your eyes, or ears in this case. I have given up on some pieces that I messed up always, and I thought, okay, if at this point in my life I can't make anything out of that score, then you should actually smell the coffee at this point. Okay, give it up. And then there are pieces that have opened themselves up in a way I couldn't even imagine when I was in my 20s and so on. And yet, sometimes I hear a very old recording of something. In most cases I think, okay, that's embarrassing. But sometimes I think, okay, well, I'm not sure I could do this like that now. Because sometimes ignorance is a very good engine. If you think of ski jumpers, the good ones are all quite similar mentally. They have very little imagination. And I respect them greatly, but they are not the sort of fantasy creating people. They go up, go down and jump, and they don't think about what if. Because the moment you start thinking about what if, you're done. And then you're like the Billy the Eagle or whatever the British guy was a ski jumper and looked like a bat. Anyway, so it's when you really don't know what could happen, you can do things quite surprisingly well sometimes. Tenors, same thing. I think commercial airline pilots are being tested and the selection favors people who have no fantasy. You don't want to have a sort of a poetic, sensitive person flying your Boeing. you want to have a person who reacts. Okay, that seems to be a problem, so I'll fix it like this. Okay.
So I specifically would like to know something about the way, and I have a question here. Your conducting is characterized by an intense, total concentration. It makes it impossible not to listen and keeps the mind from wandering. I would agree with that. But I wanted to ask you specifically about the physicality of conducting and whether that's changed. So I'm just imagining you as a young man in front of a major orchestra for the first time, having to communicate your ideas and wrestle knowledge to the ground in a very short space of time in front of 100 people who are very dubious of your abilities to do this. I'm not sure that dubiousness has necessarily evaporated because orchestras are congenitally trained to think that they can do the conducting just as well as the guy who's on the podium. But nevertheless, clearly your whole relationship to the orchestra, to the music has changed. And when you are, now obviously every piece is different, but I'm really interested in the actual physicality, right? So anybody who goes to concerts with any regularity has seen a very wide range of physical relationships, physical expressions of the music, right? Fritz Reiner famously had this long baton and would move it so minutely that a double bass player once brought binoculars to him. Karajan would sort of scoop great quantities of earth out of the ground. And Kurt Mazur would waggle his fingers as if to say, look, no downbeat. And you have this very intense, sharp, athletic way of conducting. You have this sort of signature move of sort of the back scratch. Bringing the baton back so where the orchestra can't see it.
Multitasking.
So I have a very technical fundamental question. How does an orchestra person know what those things are supposed to mean?
I wonder myself sometimes. You know, the trick is that a good conductor lets the orchestra play and doesn't get in the way. It sounds very simple, and it is if you know how to do it. And but that's a skill that nobody's born with. That only comes with experience, because the misunderstanding of many or most or all young conductors is that they are somehow necessary, important, and they conduct everything and everybody, and they and of course it's like riding a horse. A good jockey, the horse knows when to jump over the fence. It doesn't need this sort of massive control or kicking, you know, whatever you do when you are trying to make a horse jump. So it's more like letting the horse do something it very well knows how to do. Conducting, same thing, that you let an orchestra take care of its business, and then you just inject things when they need it. And if your back itches, then you can, of course. But so that is something that I've learned, and I'm still learning. I mean, happy to report that every day is a learning experience, and I'm not trying to be cute or coy, but it really is immensely complex thing, this conducting. And when you work with an orchestra for a very long time, like I did in LA, and with the Philharmonia in London, I've been with them since '83, regularly. So there are moments when I'm thinking of something, and I swear I haven't done anything physical, and they do it already. So it's like and it unfortunately works the other way around as well. If I'm thinking something which is actually not right, I have like a memory slip before it happens, and I don't even have time to do anything, and somebody already makes a mistake. You get so finely tuned to each other, and that's incredibly satisfying and scary, because it clearly is a type of communication that as of yet is unknown to physics, but it's there. I mean, every musician knows this. It's like if you ever watch those films of schools of fish, like mackerel, they swim in this perfect formation, and then a predator turns up and they curl into a ball. And nobody knows how this has been done and how they keep the perfect distance. Which one of the fish is the one who gives the impulse to curve into a ball? So it's really mysterious, and it may be a totally simple equation, algorithm, that maybe one fish is aware of two others or three others, and that being multiplied becomes this sort of AI thing, that the school of fish has an artificial intelligence that is way beyond the intelligence of one fish. But it can also be incredibly complex. We don't know this. And sometimes I think about orchestras in this way, that what is the mechanism really within an orchestra itself, between the musicians and between the conductor and the musicians? It's really quite fascinating, because it's a very fragile agreement between them and me, that when my hand does this, they play. Because there's no...
You can't make them.
No, they play because they somehow allow themselves to do that. So what is the perfect movement for any given musical moment or phrase? There has to be something that also not only forces them but invites them. And there's no theory, at least to my knowledge, to cover that, but we learn.
I once was interviewing members of the New York Philharmonic about this very topic, and I remember talking to the principal cellist, Carter Bray, who said, you know, most of the conductors who come, they really know what they're doing, and we pay a lot of attention, and we'll do whatever it is they ask. In that moment, we're very reactive. Every once in a while, though, there's somebody who really doesn't have a clear idea of what the music is supposed to sound like, and I asked him, well, so what happens at that point? He said, well, we take over. and I said, in what way? And he said, well, you know, I'm a principal cellist, so, you know, I'm at the center of the orchestra. Sometimes it's the concertmaster, but often I sort of step in and I take over. And the conductor doesn't have any idea this is happening. I said, well, how does the rest of the orchestra know? And he said, they know. I just want to close with a little excerpt, if we could watch. This is a little bit of the rehearsal of Elektra. This is Metropolitan Opera Orchestra.
It's a waltz. Comment on your conductor. Busy guy, but you know, this is amazing because this was the very first reading with the Met Orchestra. They start from this level with Elektra, which is the most difficult score in the repertoire. So they start on this level. So I get this still. I've been doing this for a long time, but I get these feelings of, I guess gratitude is the word. When I'm, you know, deep in the pit, and I have Nina Stem and Adrien Piazzonka singing right at me at the end of Elektra, this amazing duet, and this band is in the pit playing, and I think, okay, you know what, this is okay. it's really not bad. It's good to remember that from time to time, because there's so much other stuff in, you know, musical life and any career which is kind of international and so on, that you sometimes think, well, why am I doing this? But then there are these moments when I very well know why I'm doing this, for the sheer pleasure.
And with everything that you have been doing and as much as you've accomplished in all these years, I have a question from somebody in the audience. What's your goal 20 years from now? What would you like to be?
I would like to be alive.
That's a good start.
So I keep popping my cholesterol pills, as long as they haven't been proven harmful. Well, I think by and large, getting older has been a surprisingly pleasant process. There are some, you know, aches and pains, and and sleep seems to be more elusive than it used to be, and my memory is not quite what it used to be. So all these things. But on the plus side, there's this. I care much less about how I'm being perceived, because you learn at some point in life that you're you, and that's it. You can't do much about it. I mean, you can have a haircut, you can take a shower to improve things, but by and large, you're stuck with that, and it's relaxing. And in like my profession where I'm dealing with these complexities, with people, orchestras and so on. It's kind of relaxing thought that when I go in front of an orchestra, it's like, okay, guys, this is how I am. If that's okay, good, let's work. If not, then you know what? I can also go home and go fishing or something. And I quite like that. So I'm hoping that 20 years from now, I'm even further into that sort of peace of mind land. And of course I would like to have written an opera or two at that point, and I hope that we haven't destroyed the planet completely at that point, because I would like to buy a bigger boat and drive around the Baltic Sea and go fishing.
All right. Well, thank you very much.